Martha. Well, it's great to be here. And I'm honoured to have so many old friends in the audience. With an emphasis on the friends and not the old, of course. I was surprised. I am surprised. Now, I've given this talk over the last few years in the UK, in Australia, New Zealand, Canada. But I've never given it in America, so I'm just hoping that Guantanamo is closed now. Okay, but anyway, if I don't get out, I'm going to blame you guys. But this is probably one of the most liberal places in the country to do this talk. But more importantly, if I will say some things about America and drug policy, and if they're wrong, will you just correct me afterwards, please? Anyway, it's a great pleasure to be here, and as Martha said, I had the interesting experience of being sacked from my position as a drug czar in Britain about 9 years ago now. And there's the image of me being removed from my laboratory. The Home Secretary, the Secretary of, I guess, Secretary of State, hand over my mouth. The reason I was sacked was for saying that basically the government, our policy at the time, which was to vilify things, drugs like cannabis, you can see the book of cannabis falling from my hand, and to generate hysteria around drugs, new drugs that are strange green chemicals in those plastic bags. That was largely a smokescreen driven by a combination of political and also economic interests designed to minimise attention to the drugs, which were really harmful in Britain. And you can see those in the scales of justice, pulling down the scales of justice on the left, which are beer and cigarettes. And that was not a policy that the statement the government liked, because then, as now, they were very deeply in debt to the drinks industry, and so they tried to shut me up by sacking me. That was actually a really dumb thing to do. If anyone knew me, it was probably the worst thing you could possibly do, because it gave me ammunition and also a lot of public sympathy. It's quite remarkable, though, that particular week, because my sacking coincided with Andre Agassi releasing his biography. There you go, it's top left-hand corner. Any of you remember him? Yeah, he was a very good tennis player. And it's funny, isn't it, that he sells his biography on the grounds that he took crystal meth rather than won Wimbledon. And that's quite a fascinating observation, and it really tells us that drugs are strange things. People are more interested in drugs than they are in tennis. Well, that's not strange, but but someone could sum up their life as a tennis player on the grounds that he'd actually lied about testing positive for crystal meth when he was the #1 player in the world. And of course, why did he lie? Well, he lied because the drug laws, in the tennis regulations on drugs, say that if you test positive for a Schedule 1 drug, you will be a minimum ban of 2 years, like Sharapova got, or a lifetime ban. And he didn't want that, quite reasonably actually. I wouldn't have wanted that either. It was my livelihood. So he decided to tell the truth. Well, he decided to lie. And I think it was a very British thing. What the British, he was tested in Britain, and the Brits did what I think was a really very British thing. They decided to ask him to tell the truth. Have you ever taken crystal meth, Andre? And he said, don't be stupid. Your drug testers are as useless as your tennis players. They just get it wrong. And so he said, oh, thank goodness, never pee into a bottle again. And he never did, I presume. But when it came to selling his biography, he decided to come clean. And that tells us, the enormous, there's a lot more money in telling the truth about drugs if you're a tennis player than there is about telling about your double-fisted backhand or whatever. Anyway, that's just a little fascinating kind of bit of serendipity, the two things happening the same week. Why was I saying that cannabis was actually less harmful than the drugs like alcohol? Well, I'll show you the data I based it on then. But at the time, there was some dissent, at least amongst some of the academic community, that cannabis might not be less harmful than alcohol. But now I know I'm right, because your past president came out saying the same thing. And this was, for those of you, I guess, who live here, that was a remarkable statement. I mean, I say, and I may be wrong, but I'm going to look to the experts, that's the first time an American president has ever told the truth about drugs. We'll have that debate over dinner, okay? Put me right if I'm not right or not right. But it was a remarkable statement, and you all know why, because, of course, the feds were just attacking pharmacies, particularly cannabis pharmacies in California. And Obama didn't want an internal war, and none of us did, I guess, none of you did. And so he said, we're not going to do it, and why we're not going to do it? Because cannabis is less harmful than alcohol. So how did he know that, and how did we know that? Well, I want to introduce to you a technique that we developed back in the 2000s, trying to assess the harms of drugs. I spent a lot of time trying to work out how we can get the best estimates of harm. And while I was still a favoured son of our administration, we developed a technique called multi-criteria decision analysis to essentially come up with the best estimates of the different harms of drugs. And this was published on the government's website in July 2010. And this was a complicated process. We took a group of experts, the Advisory Council on the Misuse of Drugs. We locked them in a hotel for a weekend. We got them to write down every conceivable harm that a drug could produce, everything from killing you the first time you take it to deforestation in Colombia as a result of trying to eliminate the cocaine trade. Thousands of post-its all around a room about as big as this. And then over the rest of the time we coalesced the post-its, and we came down to the fact that there are actually 16 different ways in which drugs can harm you. 9 harms are to the people who use drugs, harms to the users, and 7 are the harms to other people, to society. And then we have to come up with definitions of each of these, which we did, and then subsequently we convened another meeting where we brought a similar group of experts together to rate and rank these 20 drugs on those 16 parameters of harm. And some of these are legal drugs, some are illegal drugs, but they have a range of different pharmacologies and effects, etc. And that again was a big process. Every drug had to be ranked on a ratio scale on each of those 16 scales. And then we did a weighting to decide which of the individual scales we thought were more important than the others, so every scale was then weighted. And then after quite a bit of computing, out came this graph, which has now become really quite famous. And this is the final summation of that process of analysis. And it's color-coded. The blue bars give you relative estimates of the harm of the drug to users, and the red bar of the harm of the drug to society, to other people. And to my surprise, I didn't expect this, but alcohol came out as the most harmful drug, which is why I was saying it was the most harmful. And the reason for that is the size of the red bar, and the red bar is huge because alcohol is very commonly used. It's a harmful drug, you all know that, and it's widely used. So the harms to other people are profound. It's responsible or involved in over half of road traffic accidents, probably the vast majority of domestic violence. The healthcare costs are enormous, the policing costs are twice the healthcare costs in Britain, etc., etc. I don't need to go into the harms of alcohol. Interestingly, you can see, if you go along to the 4th drug along, crystal meth, there's a very different profile. Crystal meth has almost no red bar because in Britain at that time, crystal meth was hardly used. There's some small groups of Filipinos, a few small fraction of the gay community was using crystal meth. So the social harms of crystal meth are almost non-existent. Of course, the harms of crystal meth, the size of the blue bar, are greater than those of alcohol and drugs to the right of it. But this does give a fairly clear graphic as to the relative harms of those 20 different drugs. Now that was, I thought, an interesting and important thing to do. It should help direct policy. If your drug policy is about reducing harms, then alcohol is the drug to target. We actually redid this. This was sufficient interest that the European Commission asked us to redo it in Europe. We did it again. We took 30 European experts, 20 different countries. They changed every ranking, they changed every weighting, and the final result was almost identical. Only one drug changed place, which was GHB. So it's extremely stable. And we've recently done it in Australia, and we've come to very similar conclusions. So we know that this is the best assessment of drug harms that we can come to. Now, I'd dearly love to do it in America. I just hang that out there for anyone who wants to find us. Now, one interpretation or one analysis from this is that there is no relationship whatsoever between the harms of drugs and their position in either the UK or the UN Conventions on Drug Harms. There's no correlation at all. Now, that's a problem to us because the UK Misuse of Drugs Act is supposed to be based on harms. And so the fact that it isn't and the UN conventions aren't, I think, is a serious challenge to any of us who want some kind of evidence directing policy. I think the fact that drug laws aren't evidence-based is immoral. They're also probably illegal, but we've considered taking the UK government to court. We haven't done so because it would be very expensive, and we know we would lose because they control the cards. But actually, the British government is in breach of its own laws in perpetuating a Drugs Act which actually isn't based on evidence of harm. Now, why does this matter? Well, there are many aspects and many different ways we could consider that problem, but I'm going to focus now on, for the rest of my talk, largely on the fact that this failure to properly evaluate and properly account for the relative harms of drugs has actually led to enormous problems in relation to treatments. Because when we look at many of the drugs, many of the commonly used recreational drugs, we see that they are also medicines. Now, the great thing is that your country has actually woken up to that fact. The devolved responsibility for healthcare in America means that you do have access to medical cannabis. At least 200 million Americans have. In Britain, until a couple of months ago, no one had. And that's one of the reasons I've been banging on about cannabis and trying to make a rational approach to cannabis in Britain for some time. But other drugs that are also illegal had medical value. So ecstasy was being widely used for psychotherapy. It's now been resurrected for the treatment of PTSD. There's some evidence it may help with dyskinesia to Parkinson's disease. Psilocybin, I'm going to show you later, has utility in depression, OCD, and cluster headaches. LSD, before it was made illegal, was being used to help people come to terms with dying. It also has very powerful evidence in addiction. And mephedrone, which is a drug which became very popular in Britain, a drug called MCAT, meow meow, drone. You'd think you'd call it bath salts, but that was a very interesting drug, and I'm going to come back to that a bit later on, because the use of mephedrone turned out to be one of the most fascinating natural experiments in the history of harm reduction, produced through the free market as opposed to produced through doctors. So there's a lot of opportunity for research because the potential for clinical interventions, wide potential, but current regulations mean that they're virtually impossible to research. And that's wrong. And if the law is impeding such research opportunities, then we should challenge it. It's actually worse in other countries. Some countries, like China and India, don't bother to try to make drugs available which are controlled under the UN conventions because they can't be bothered to bring in to comply with the regulations for safe custody. So rather than have secure holding for drugs like morphine, they just don't bother to make them available. So almost half the world's population doesn't have access to strong painkillers, even when they're in extreme pain. Cannabis, 20 countries out of the 225 in the world have only 20 countries that made it legal as a medicine. Psychedelics are not actually a medicine anywhere in the world at present. Mdma similarly, and that's because they're Schedule I drugs. And Schedule I in the UN conventions is a vicious black hole, because Schedule I says a drug has considerable harm and no medical value. It cannot be produced by some other drug. And when a drug goes into Schedule I, it almost never comes out. And the effect of a drug being put into Schedule 1 is profound, because research virtually stops. This is a very elegant graph. This was produced in a paper in Tips a year or so ago, looking at the publications, the number of publications per year for two drugs, LSD and psilocybin, two psychedelic drugs. And you can see the blue line are the number of publications each year for LSD and red for psilocybin. And LSD, as you know, was discovered in 1943, made available in the early 50s. Massive research interest. NIH funded over 130 grants to study LSD. 1,000 clinical papers, you can see, you can count them up. Everyone thought this was a major breakthrough in terms of neuroscience and in terms of clinical treatment. But then it was made illegal in 1967 in the US and in 1971 under the UN conventions. And publications continued for a few years because people had data to write up. But then you can see the precipitous fall in the number of publications because there was never another grant from NIH. And the same in the UK. And the same is true for psilocybin. So that shows the impact of banning a drug on our research outputs. If you're interested in reading more, I've written a couple of papers on this. The one in Nature Reviews is a detailed historical perspective on how this all came about and the impacts it had. And then there's a slightly simpler one for in PLOS Biology, which is also free, so if you want to read that. And I'm going to argue to you now that the banning of these drugs and the putting them in Schedule 1, so making them virtually impossible to research, is the worst censorship of research in the history of the world. I don't think there's any other example where science has been limited by regulations that's comparable with the banning of these drugs. Possibly you might say, well, that seems extreme, but actually the nearest I can get to is 1616, when the Catholic Church banned the telescope, or at least the writings of Copernicus, because they did not want their people knowing that the Earth was not the centre of the universe. And the principles are rather similar. The banning of the knowledge of the heavens was an attempt to make people believe what the governments or at that time the church wanted them to believe. And the banning of the research on drugs is a deliberate attempt to stop people knowing the truth, that these drugs actually do have utility and potential. The banning of the telescope really lasted 150 years. The UN conventions go back to, certainly if you take the 1961 convention on cannabis, that's 60 years. Thankfully you've overturned it, but you haven't overturned it with the other drugs. So we've got at least 50 years of banning of drugs like LSD, psilocybin. The size, the area under the curve of research in the last 50 years is massive compared with the research lost in terms of people being able to study the skies back in the 1600s. There weren't that many astronomers. And of course then, it was only the Catholic ones who couldn't study the skies. The North European Protestants were able to carry on doing what they wanted. So actually, even though this was a severe ban, it's nothing like as pervasive and as damaging as the ban on research with so-called illegal drugs. And of course, the overturning of the ban came with the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment is the intellectual movement which this university, and in fact all universities really, are founded on. And it's based on the principles of overcoming the hegemony of the church by using reason and putting science and the scientific method above historical doctrine. And I guess most of us assume that this is what underpins what we do as scientists, probably even lawyers actually, that we try to use evidence rather than the teachings of the Bible or other books. But it doesn't, and it doesn't in relation to our thinking about drug policy. You're all aware of how the Enlightenment was built on the shoulders of these great scientists and thinkers. But I'm showing you particularly this quote from Voltaire, who was the kind of narrator of the Enlightenment, and he said this: "Prejudices are what fools use for reason, And I don't think there's a better description of how our drug laws have been made and affected over the last 50 years than that. They're based on prejudice, not reason. But I want to go into it in a little bit more detail. Where do these prejudices come from, and why have people accepted them? And it turns out it's actually quite a complicated vortex of different pressures, each of which has kind of potentiated the other. So if you go around from the top left, huge impetus, particularly again across Protestant countries, including the USA, in the 19th century. The Puritan temperance movement was enormously powerful. It wanted to eliminate alcohol, it wanted to eliminate other drugs. And of course it managed to achieve that. It managed to achieve that in, was it 1923, when you guys, along with Sweden and Norway, made alcohol illegal. That was not one of the greatest successes in drug policy, as you all know. But it did lead to the perpetuation of the prohibitionist policy, even when it was removed. And that's because of the bottom left-hand corner, the fact you had to create a separate army of uncorruptible policemen. Every policeman in the States was corrupted by the bootleggers under prohibition, so you had to create a new army of uncorruptibles or untouchables, and that was led by Harry Anslinger. And Harry was, at the time, the second most famous man in America, and he was horrified at the prospect of him losing his status when alcohol was going to be made legal again. So he created the fear of other drugs, and he created the fear of marijuana and the fear of Mexicans coming across the border with drugs, destroying Western civilization. I mean, it's an interesting narrative, isn't it? It hasn't changed much. And then there's political expediency, which I'll come on to subsequently. Politicians quite rapidly, certainly from the 50s onwards, realised that there was votes to be won in drugs. And there's also the commercial interests. One perspective on the whole of the last 150 years of drug policy is that the alcohol industry has managed to eliminate all competition. Back in the 1860s, you could go to your corner shop, certainly in the UK, I imagine the same is true here, and you could buy your beer, but you could buy your tincture of cannabis, you could buy your tincture of opium, you could buy your tincture of cocaine. Everyone was happy. Now you can only buy alcohol, because the alcohol industry has been very good at eliminating any competition. And the pharmaceutical industry are not major players in this, but they've also changed the way we've been allowed to think about drugs, and we've had to think about drugs now, currently, particularly medical drugs, as being pure synthetic chemicals or even pure extracts of plants rather than plant-based, and that's a more subtle attempt to gain traction in a market. So we've got these four separate powers pushing prohibition. And the political angle, I think, is perhaps the most important one now, because that's the kind of residuum we're living with. And I just want to make sure every one of you has seen this quote from John Ehrlichman, who was the advisor to Richard Nixon. And I think this is the most chilling example of political expediency I've probably ever seen. The Nixon 1968 campaign had two enemies, the anti-war left and black people. And that's those of you who, you probably remember those days, don't you? You probably remember he was not going to be re-elected. So he had to do something, Nixon had to do something. And Ehrlichman worked out what to do. He said, we knew we couldn't make it illegal to be either against the war or black. I kind of think they thought about that. But by getting the public to associate the hippies with marijuana and blacks with heroin, and then criminalising both heavily, we could disrupt those communities. We could arrest their leaders, raid their homes, break up their meetings, and vilify them night after night on the evening news. Fantastically successful. Nixon won every state but Maine, I think. Great policy, works. Continued to work ever since. Did we know we were lying about the drugs? Of course we did. And in fact, that's the truth. My government knows it's lying about the drugs. Pretty much every drugs minister, when they resign or step down, say we got it wrong. But they don't do anything when they're in power. And lies are problematic. Here are two great quotes about lies. Charles Darwin, there's an older version, said, false facts are very injurious to science, for they endure long. And your homegrown expert, Mark Twain, how easy it is to make people to believe a lie, and how hard it is to undo that. Now, I'll just give you a few examples of this in relation to me and the UK. So, cannabis has been a very useful political tool in Britain because the government controls the policy, unlike in your country. So that's the man that sacked me, the Home Secretary. There's me, you can see, with a moustache and a spliff. And the other people there, the other scientists who resigned when I was sacked. The history of cannabis in Britain is fascinating because it spans my career as a doctor. And I started training in 1969. In 1970, we started collecting data on cannabis users. 500,000 people in 1970 had used cannabis. And when we stopped collecting data, which was a few years ago, there were 10 million. So it was a 20-fold increase in the number of people using cannabis in those 40 years. And probably 100 times as much cannabis used. But it was still illegal. How could the government justify keeping something illegal, particularly when it had medical value? They were keeping it illegal because they were scared the medical use might lead to recreational use. How could they justify that keeping a drug which is so widely used illegal, particularly when there were no deaths? So here are the deaths from various drugs in the UK, and you see on the left the big killers of tobacco, where you get 80,000 deaths, premature deaths a year. Alcohol, over 20,000, opiates, somewhere over 1,000 or so. And down on the right-hand end, you see cannabis, and there's virtually no death. So cannabis isn't killing people. How can you control, how can you ban a drug which actually isn't really apparently harming people? And the arguments were around things like driving and schizophrenia, so they were fabricated arguments. And they've continued so far. We've only just, in the last few months, allowed cannabis to medicine. It's still a long way from being available as a recreation. But we have been fighting back. One of the biggest challenges we found in the UK was to get pharmacists on board. Pharmacists are often quite reluctant to put their heads above the parapet, but we did manage to get a debate in the Royal Pharmaceutical Society's meeting, and we managed, the debate was won, and the Pharmaceutical Society now is in favour of medical marijuana. And one of the arguments, and this is something I'd be interested in discussing with you here, who may be more expert on this, but one of the ways we were able to assuage people's fears about medical cannabis is this fear that it's going to add to the burden of illness, and people are going to be having more accidents with driving when drunk and stoned than when driving, perhaps just when drunk. But it does seem, at least there is some evidence to suggest that you don't get added problems. In fact, if anything, you may get some attenuation, some attrition in the deaths from prescription opioids and alcohol when people switch. Now, of course, cannabis is the world's oldest medicine. It's been identified in tombs going back 2,000 to 3,000 years BC. The Chinese even had a character for it, which means it must have been relevant to them in their society. And the history of cannabis and cannabis prohibition is really intriguing. I told you already how Harry Anslinger invented the fear of cannabis, but it went way beyond America, because as you're probably all aware, America essentially dictated international health policy. It probably still does. And in 1934, the League of Nations decided that cannabis had no medical value. And the WHO, the inheritors of the League of Nations, have never since reviewed the value of cannabis as a medicine. In 2016, I went and represented a group of international experts. I went to the WHO and asked them to receive a report we had written, which basically outlined the value of cannabis as a medicine. And they refused to receive it on the grounds that they hadn't contracted it. And while we were there, we asked if we could see the original 1934 report on which the decision that cannabis has no medical value is still They're still arrested. And they said, no, we've lost that report. So the whole international position, the WHO position on cannabis, is based on a report which they haven't got. And that we actually managed to change things. Some of you may know that last November they did review cannabis, they did review the medical value of cannabis. The report's not published yet, because it almost certainly says it is a medicine, and it almost certainly isn't going to be, that decision is not going to be endorsed by your government, it's not going to be endorsed by the Russians and the Chinese, and you're the triumvirate that control the WHO at present. But anyway, at least it's been reviewed, so hopefully at some point the truth will come out. Well, let's move on from cannabis. Let's look at MDMA. You know, MDMA was a drug that was rediscovered by Shulgin, the chemist working for the DEA back in the 50s. He thought it was rather remarkable in the clarity of insight it gave him, and also the empathy it developed. He gave it to his wife. His wife said, "This is a remarkable drug. Why should we be using this in therapy?" She was a psychotherapist. There was quite a lot of use by MDMA back in the 60s and 70s, particularly on the West Coast, when it was called empathy. And then some idiot decided it would be a good way of making money because it was legal, selling empathy in raves, in clubs, and they changed the name to ecstasy. And that name, the name change created such hysteria in the establishment and in the press that it had to be banned. And it was banned in most countries in the world. I think it's the UN banned it. But it was a medicine then, and now it's been resurrected through the work of the MAPS organisation, and it's been resurrected because of PTSD. And PTSD really is the disorder of our time. We know that vast numbers of Rwandans and the genocide. It seems to me that the majority of Syrians will probably have PTSD as well if you've had to live through what's going on in Aleppo. And also this paradox, this big problem that particularly your military have, that now soldiers are more likely to kill themselves than be killed by the enemy. It's because of the trauma that they're suffering as a result of fighting and being blown up and seeing their friends and mates killed. So PTSD is a huge problem, and it's difficult to treat. We don't have very good treatments. What we do have, though, is fascinating trials from this family team, the Mithoffers. This is their first study. They took people with PTSD who failed on 2 previous treatments, drug treatment, SSRIs, and psychotherapy. And they gave them 2 psychotherapy sessions under MDMA with extensive exposure therapy during the drug experience, so they could overcome and suppress, extinguish the emotions that come with PTSD. PTSD is a disorder where the memory and the associated emotions emerge into consciousness for no obvious reason. Sometimes they're triggered. It's the emotions which disrupt your life, because you're back to being blown up or raped or whatever, and what you have to do is you have to relive the experience and extinguish the emotions. And under just two separate MDMA sessions 2 weeks apart, those people were able to recover, get below the blue line, which is the CAPS score for being significantly ill, and amazingly stay well for many, many years. Some people have been well for 7 years after this therapy. So this is a transient intervention that leads to very long-lasting outcomes. But how does it work? Well, amazingly, there are virtually no studies of the effect of MDMA in the brain. And actually, really the first which you might call sort of open study of MDMA in the brain, we did. And to get funding for this study, we had to go, well, we didn't. We got funding from a TV channel. We could never get funding from the government because they said, well, we can't, if you were to study MDMA, if we were to fund you to study MDMA, it would be as if we were endorsing its recreational use. He said, that's ridiculous. You know, 1 million people a weekend are using MDMA in Britain. We should study it, particularly as it has therapeutic utility, but we couldn't get funding. But this TV company came along and said, would we study a drug live on TV, and we said so, and we did that. And there's the presenter, John Snow, one of the top TV presenters in the UK. And we did a study where we gave MDMA to people, mostly volunteers, but we gave it to a few celebrities as well, because the TV people wanted someone who would talk to them. We gave it to one of yours. We gave it to Lana Shriver. We gave her 100 milligrams of MDMA, and we scanned her brain. And when she came out, she said, "That was pathetic. I want more next time." So, anyway, she's a very tough woman. While we did that study, we got people to relive memories, positive memories, negative memories, in the scanner. As you see on the left-hand side, MDMA enhanced positive memories, as you'd expect. But on the right-hand side of that slide, you see they actually attenuated negative memories. And that kind of supports the utility of it as a therapy, because what you need to do, as I explained, in PTSD is get the memories back, but under control so that you can extinguish them. So that was rather pleasing. It does seem to do in the scanner what it does therapeutically. But much more importantly, we were able to show where it worked in the brain. Now these are fMRI images looking at brain blood flow. When you see these images, blue is reduced blood flow. Now what MDMA is doing is dampening down blood flow in this. I don't know if this is working.
Yep.
Yeah, you can see. This is the amygdala, this is the hippocampus. So it's dampening down activity in the emotional memory circuit in the brain, which is exactly what you wanted to do, a drug to do, if you're going to help people overcome the emotion associated with the memory. So now we have an intellectual basis on which we can really justify doing more trials. And in fact, we're doing a study now where we are using MDMA to treat alcoholics. Alcoholics who drink to overcome memories of trauma are actually self-medicating. It's a pretty ineffective form of self-medication. And we're seeing if we can help them by overcoming the trauma through an MDMA, a 2-session MDMA treatment program, be able to control their drinking. And then I want to finish with psychedelics really. I want to talk about the evolution of research on psychedelics, which has, I think, huge implications for psychiatry and addiction. So those are magic mushrooms. They make the active ingredients psilocybin. Psilocybin, like LSD, works on serotonin receptors, a 5-HT2A receptor. Then we did the first brain imaging studies with psilocybin. And if you're interested in the neuroscience, I'm going to talk about it tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock at another meeting here, but haven't got time today. But psilocybin, like MDMA, doesn't turn on the brain, it actually turns off the brain. But it turns off completely different parts of the brain to MDMA. MDMA is not remotely psychedelic. Psilocybin is psychedelic. It's psychedelic because it switches off the default mode, the network in the brain which regulates your sense of self. And one part of the default mode is that area in the ring there. That area is called the subgenual cingulate cortex. And that part of the brain is responsible, it's one of the nodes which drives depressive thinking. In fact, every known treatment of depression dampens down activity in the subgenual cingulate. So we did the study, we scanned the brains, and we did it 3 times, and we found the same effect. And then we thought, well, if psilocybin is switching off the parts of the brain which is involved in driving particularly depressive rumination, maybe we could use it to treat depression. And we were comforted in that by the fact that Ronan Griffiths up down the road in Johns Hopkins had done a study in non-depressed people where he'd shown that a single psilocybin trip, the same dose as we gave, 25 milligrams, could produce quite enduring benefits in the sense of well-being in people. So he'd shown he could improve well-being, maybe it would lift depression. So we wrote a grant. The only money we've ever gotten from the government to work on these drugs was to do a study of resistant depression, which is, I suppose, reasonable because it is the biggest problem in Western medicine. And we got the grant, to my surprise. But that was the easy bit. Getting ethical permission to do this took 3 iterations. And the ethics committee said, it's too dangerous. And we said, well, 1 million people a year in Britain take mushrooms. No one's ever died. Why is it too dangerous? But they're not depressed. So probably some of them are actually, but anyway. In the end, we couldn't do a controlled trial. No, they insisted we had to do an open safety study. We treated 12 people with one dose, and if they didn't die in 6 months, we could then do a control trial. And actually, in the end, they have such power, there's nothing we could do. We had to say, sure, we'll do that. But they did give us permission to rate their mood, just in case it got worse. And that was good. So the mood was a secondary outcome, as I'll show you, it's a very important outcome. But that, in a way, that was easier. Getting the drug supply took 30 months. Only one place in the world will make psilocybin to a level which is adequate to be given to humans. And then it took another 2 months to get our regulators, or the UK equivalent of the FDA, to allow us to give the drug. The cost of all that is £1,500 a dose. And when I speak to our equivalent of the FDA, I say, these drugs cost an awful lot of money because there's a lot of time going through all these hurdles, but also I have to have a special police check to be able to work with psilocybin. I can write a prescription for heroin, but I have to have a special check and I have a special safe to put my psilocybin. Why is that? And they say, well, you could be dealing it on the streets. I say to them, £1,500 a dose, I'm never going to deal that, not even in Chelsea am I going to get £1,500. Anyway, we did it. It took a long time. It was very tortured because it was only a 36-month grant, so we extended it. But we did it. And in the end, the results were really quite remarkable. So these are the 12 people in the first stage of the study. They all had resistant depression. They'd all failed on at least 2 drug treatments. They'd all failed CBT. And they all got better. Some people got so much better, they're in the yellow band. The yellow band is recovered. That's remission from depression. This is probably the most powerful antidepressant effect from a single treatment of a drug ever. And it's enduring. In some cases, people are still well. The majority, though, the effect begins to wane off. And that's because whatever the process is driving depression is often very deep-seated. And now we're in a really difficult position because some of these people who were really very well are now very ill again. And they want me to re-administer psilocybin, and I cannot do that because it's illegal. And I don't have a trial going on they can go into. And I worry they're going to commit suicide, and I don't know what I can do about that. We're not the only ones. There have been 2 really good trials, 2 double-blind trials conducted in the US, Steve Ross and Rona Griffiths. They looked at people who had what we call end-of-life depression and anxiety. They have terminal diagnosis, and they've used psilocybin or controlled placebo and shown a benefit to help people come to terms with end-of-life anxieties. And a multi-center study is starting soon. And actually, this particular research in depression has was seen as so powerful that both the FDA and the European Medicines Agency have given the company called Compassion Pathways, or Compass, a breakthrough diagnosis. So if they get this big multi-center trial that's positive, they'll fast track to being a medicine. But how we'll use a medicine, which is, they have to, if it's still in Schedule 1, it won't be possible to use it, but hopefully it will come out of that schedule. And I just want to mention tomorrow I'm giving a much more detailed talk on our psychedelic neuroscience tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock if you want to come along. I mentioned already the potential for addiction. This is a fascinating analysis. This is a meta-analysis of the 6 NIH-funded trials of LSD and alcoholism. So here are people given 1, 2 or 3 doses of LSD back in the 50s and 60s. And the effect size for LSD in alcoholism is better than any treatment we have today. And I've estimated, if you count back now to when it was made illegal, 67, probably over 100 million people worldwide have died prematurely from alcoholism. Suppose LSD could help 10% of them. That's 10 million premature deaths. That's kind of almost the same number as die from malaria. Why don't we do that? Why do we deny people who might benefit from these drugs access to it? Well, the reason is because we want to stop recreational use. Have we stopped recreational use? There are also some very interesting trials now of Psilocybin and Addiction. There's a Hopkins study with tobacco addiction, a Mexico Bogenschutz study for alcohol addiction. And people are also now beginning to resurrect some old Russian works looking at ketamine for the treatment of alcoholism and heroin dependence. And I've mentioned our Mdma study. So, there's a lot of potential here. But when you start to have discussions about this, about bringing these drugs out back from Schedule 1 into medicine, you get a number of arguments. People say, well, medical use will encourage recreational use. Actually, that's kind of bizarre. Especially in a country like Britain, we have the highest use of cannabis in Europe, and it's illegal. Medical use will displace to recreational use, but I mean, has anyone really seen that? Now, maybe you guys are seeing some of that, but we've prescribed drugs like heroin in Britain. We don't see displacement to recreational use for those drugs. And this is the other one, and this perhaps is the most important one. It gives the wrong message. And I would argue that the truth is rarely, if ever, wrong. But of course, some people don't like the truth, and the truth is often seen to be wrong by the government when they're at war. This is the quote: "When war comes, reason is regarded as treason." And that's the problem when you're fighting a war on drugs, allows a complete distortion of reason so that it becomes treason. And that's another really good reason why we should get rid of the stupid concept of a war on drugs. And if we were more open-minded, we could do some remarkable things. We could do what the Swedes have done, which is eliminate lung cancer in men in Sweden by switching to snus. Swedish men have the same rates of lung cancer as Islamic women who don't smoke. One of those powerful public health experiments in history. You've at last allowed snus in your country, but we still don't. We don't allow snus in Britain or the rest of Europe because the tobacco industry still controls our decision makers. We could replace alcohol. I have invented drugs which give the same effect as alcohol. They work on the parts of the brain which give the benefits of alcohol. They don't produce the downside of alcohol. They would be to alcohol what aspartame is for sugar. It gives you the pleasure without the calories. Are they legal? Yes, they're legal in this country. Will they stay legal if we consider them to be drugs? Well, then the answer is possibly not. And that uncertainty is a huge disincentive to investors, because it's not cheap to take a drug through the food standards marketing in this country and Europe. It costs tens of millions of dollars. And the uncertainty about legal status is a big disincentive. And I said I'd come back to this. This is, as I say, one of the greatest natural experiments in harm reduction. Certainly the only one that's ever been done, really, by the free market. And it's mephedrone. Mephedrone is a weak cathinone. Okay? It was called MCAT, meow meow, and you call it bath salts. I don't know if you had much of it, you had a variety there. Anyway, but mephedrone came into Britain in 2008. The dotted line, the first dotted line. And what you see there is the rise in the number of deaths per million people from cocaine and from amphetamines over the preceding 10 or so years. You can see that inexorable rise of cocaine deaths until mephedrone comes along. Now, mephedrone was legal. It was sold in 1 gram quantities, and it became widely used. And many people who took cocaine switched. They switched because it was legal, and they switched because they knew what they were getting. And you can see this precipitate fall in cocaine deaths. Cocaine death rates halved when people had access to a legal, safe alternative. And amphetamine death rates fell as well. So over the 2 years mephedrone was legal, probably about 500 fewer deaths from cocaine and amphetamines in Britain. Amazing. Nothing else we've ever done has achieved that. But because it was a new drug and because the media didn't like it, they got it banned. And it was banned, the second dotted line, after 2 years it was banned. There was a year where stockpiles were used up, and then people just switched. If everything's illegal, well, cocaine's more fun than mephedrone. So people switched to cocaine, and we've had the highest number of cocaine deaths ever, and the highest number of amphetamine deaths ever. And I just think that's just truly a remarkable social experiment. No one did it, no scientist did it. It was just, people don't want to die when they take drugs, and they quite like not to break the law. And I want to just finish by talking a little bit about policy, because some of you are lawyers and some of you might be able to affect some policy. And I've thought for a long time about what the criteria should be that determine whether a drug should be controlled or not. Now, the current decision-making process is largely, as I've said, driven by the drinks industry, and that's not really satisfactory. Alcohol is a drug. Whenever you like to think about it, it's a drug. And I wrote a paper a few years ago arguing, well, if alcohol's a drug which is allowed to be sold and even advertised, how do other drugs compare? And this was an analysis, you say it's over 10 years old now, a tale of two E's. The other E is ethanol. So ethanol versus ecstasy, on most measures, ecstasy is less harmful than alcohol. In fact, if you look at the size of the blue bars here, the harm to the user, most drugs are less harmful to the user than alcohol. And that raises a very interesting moral point, really. Should drugs that are less harmful to the user than alcohol be made available in pharmacies? Would that not be a rational approach? Now, you could argue, well, it might not be rational. It might be it would just encourage more drug use and there might be more harms. But I'm not sure. I think at the very least we should debate it and we should try to think it through. How can we do that without actually changing the law to actually see in the real world what would happen? Well, a couple of years ago, we were approached to do something similar by the Norwegian government, who funded this Institute for Alcohol and Drug Research. Now, Norway is a fascinating country. It's the richest country in the world, per capita. And yet it has death rates from heroin twice that of our worst, which is Scotland. And there's that kind of mismatch they find very distasteful. You know, and they wanted to do something about it. So they asked us to see if we could create a model using a multi-criteria decision approach, which looked at policies rather than drug harms. And that turned out to be something we could do. It was actually quite difficult to do, but we did it. It turns out there are 27 different criteria you have to evaluate if you're looking at how policies might impact or how policies will affect drugs and the benefits or the harms of drugs. The paper was published just last year. I'm going to give you an example. This is really complicated to do. Obviously, there are many. Those are the different considerations you have to take into account when you change a policy. 27 variables there. Because there's so many of them and there's so many different policies, we decided to basically set up an thought experiment where we had 4 policies. You can see them there. One's absolute prohibition, one is decriminalisation, one is state control, and one is a free market. And because it's so difficult to do, we were only able to do a few drugs in the conference we did. But it turned out very interesting. And these are the results for cannabis. So on the left, you see free market, which I guess is Colorado. Then you see state control, which is Uruguay. Decriminalisation, which is Spain. And absolute prohibition, which is Britain. And the higher the bar, the better the outcome. And the colours show you where that improved outcome comes from. And so we would argue from this that a state-controlled approach to cannabis availability is the right way forward. And I suppose in a way that's sort of what cannabis is doing now. But then you could compare it with alcohol. And interesting, alcohol is similarly best provided under state control. In fact, but absolute prohibition is much less harmful for alcohol than it was for cannabis, because it doesn't drive the black market with alcohol isn't as toxic as the black market with cannabis, because the black market with cannabis now in Britain are these synthetic cannabinoids which are killing lots and lots of people. So you can begin to approach policy decisions using a detailed, rational approach. And I just want to finish with a couple of quotes from inspirational thinkers in the past. There's George Bernard Shaw, the playwright and philosopher, who said, "Those who cannot change their minds cannot change anything." And, well, you know, that's why we've got to keep an open mind. And then I think also this, as a philosophy behind what we do, this is this quote from John Stuart Mill. "In a freedom-loving society, no conduct by a rational adult should be made criminal unless it's harmful to others." And I think that's pretty good. That would not be a bad testimony, a bad directive to live by, or to certainly make laws by. So, thank you very much, and I'll take questions.